Morning, men. Okay, so we are starting a new series this morning. Before we get into it, let's go ahead and do a shout out to the Northside Men on a Mission. These are 6 to 8 men who've been meeting for the last year and a half on Wednesday nights at 6:30 at Northside Baptist Church in Noonan, Georgia. Guys from 20 to into the 70s, so similar to what we're doing here. And thanks to Larry Chappell for putting that together. So would you join me in giving a big shout out to the guys at Northside? Hoorah! Welcome, guys. Glad to have you with us this morning. You guys are good at that, you know? You know, let me just tell you, if you have somebody down on your case, you know, and saying that you're not very good at your work or your marriage or whatever, you just tell them, you know, I'm really good at doing shout-outs on Friday morning. Okay, so this new series is called The Coolest Guys in the Bible. And just for fun, I put out on Facebook this week, I said, free iPad, if you can figure out which Old Testament character I had in mind when we put this photo up. And really what I was trying to do was to preempt the criticism that we were making an icon out of Jesus, because that would be something that I've already heard a little bit about. And so I thought if we just said which Old Testament figure, that would kind of preempt people assuming that it was Jesus, but apparently that didn't work, so I'll just go ahead and say it's not Jesus. To be completely candid with you, when we first picked the icon, I wasn't thinking of anybody. But since I decided I needed to pick out somebody, okay, so this is either Shadrach, Meshach, or Abednego, okay, in the picture. And you can take your pick. Nobody got it right on the guesses, by the way, so no iPad. And I did put on there that the offer expired at 7 a.m., so nobody can so no sense getting on your smartphone right now and trying to get the free iPad, okay? Just want to clarify that one, too. So some of the guesses for who this might be were very intriguing, but my personal favorite from Randy Mason, he says, I think it's Jim Angelakos before he found Christ. For those of you on the internet, Jim Angelakos is the administrator of our Bible study, the live one here we do on Fridays. Okay, so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are the first of the coolest guys that we're going to look at, and these are some really cool guys. Let's go ahead and look at the story, Daniel chapter 3, and let's begin verse 1. In 1945, Alexander Solzhenitsyn was arrested by Joseph Stalin because he had criticized Stalin publicly. He spent the next 8 years in prison where he learned a lot of things. Along the way, he met some Christians, and he either became a Christian or readopted the faith of his parents in his youth. But anyway, he became a Christian. He had a miraculous curing of cancer while in prison. And when Solzhenitsyn got out of prison, and even in prison, he continued to speak out publicly, uncompromisingly, about the atrocities that were taking place under the regime of the dictator, Comrade Stalin. And he chronicled those in the book Gulag Archipelago, Gulag being prison, archipelago being a chain of islands. And so he's talking about this chain of prisons across the Soviet Union. And he tells in here one story, and by the way, I to be candid, I did not finish the book. It was so depressing. I said, okay, I get it, and I put it down. One very interesting anecdote he tells, and at a meeting in a Moscow Communist Party district, the district director of the Communist Party got arrested, and the new guy was conducting the meeting, and he called for a standing ovation for Stalin. And so everybody immediately leaped to their feet because of the fear of this wicked regime. And so they began to applaud for 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. And now the older people in the crowd are now really starting to be in anguish and ready to be taken out on stretchers. Some of them, 7 minutes, 8 minutes, 9 minutes, 10 minutes. There was in the on the platform there was the owner of a paper factory in that town, in that province, and well thought of. And after 11 minutes went by, and people were now just barely able to hang on, but nobody knew how to stop because they were in such fear that whoever actually did stop would be punished for that. The first one to stop would be severely punished for it, and as it turns out was. But at the 11-minute mark, finally, the new district Communist Party director, he was afraid to stop because his predecessor had just been arrested. But this owner, this businessman, finally, to the relief of everyone, stopped after 11 minutes of a standing ovation for a man who wasn't even there, although all of his secret police were. And immediately, just everybody collapsed. And later that night, the secret police came and arrested this man who owned this paper factory, and he spent 10 years in the gulags for that. That's the kind of wicked dictator that Stalin was. And this morning we're going to look at 3 guys who lived in that kind of a regime. They lived with a dictator, and they were officials in this dictatorship. It's the regime of Nebuchadnezzar. And so let's take a look, chapter 3, verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 90 feet high, 9 feet wide, and set it on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So this guy, nobody knows what exactly this statue was, whether it was an image of himself. He was a polytheist, so it could have been one of his gods. It could have been a fully formed image. It could have been a partial image. Nobody really knows. But it was 90 feet tall. It was 9 feet wide, and it surely wasn't solid gold. I mean, it doesn't make any sense it would be solid gold. It was probably gold covered. But all this is speculation. But the point was, in the story, he then assembles all of his officials, and they're listed in the satraps, magistrates, all officials were assembled. And then they were told that when the flutes and the lyres and all the instruments started to play, that they were commanded to fall down in front of this image and worship. And so the symphony struck up, and sure enough, all the people, in fact, let's read it, verse 4, it says, "Then the herald loudly proclaimed, 'This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language.'" As soon as you hear it, you're supposed to fall down. And verse 7, "Therefore, as soon as they heard the orchestra, all the peoples and nations and men of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold." However, there were some astrologers there who came to the king and said, "King, didn't you pass the law that anybody who did not bow down would be thrown into a raging, burning fire? Well, you have some Jews living among us, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who did not bow down." Now, when Daniel, the last verse of the previous chapter 2, Daniel had done something we may or may not talk about in this series. But anyway, he was promoted to be the number 2 guy. Daniel became the number 2 guy in Babylon. And it says that at his request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This is the last verse of chapter 2. He appointed them administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. Now, we don't know where Daniel was when all these people were bowing down, but we absolutely know that Daniel was not bowing down. But he didn't get caught. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were discovered. And verse 13 says that, furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and basically said, "Is this true? Is this true? Did you really not bow down to my image?" Now you have to remember, he must be very fond of these three young men. These are three young leaders. And being fond of them, he decides to give them another chance to bow down. And so he actually reassembles his orchestra. He said, "Look, we're going to have the orchestra play again. And when they do, I want you to bow down and worship this idol." And it says in the last half of verse 15, it says, last half of verse 15, "But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace, and then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" So, yeah, he liked them, and yeah, he was going to give them another chance. But that was it. And then you see the response in verse 16. So, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar." And that was the normal greeting, "O king," you know. "We do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand. But, O king, we want you to know this. Even if he does not rescue us, we will not bow down and worship." Pretty amazing stuff. Pretty amazing stuff. And so, Nebuchadnezzar, now the veins are popping out of his neck. And so he has them seized and bound. And they have a furnace there. And I'm sure smoke was billowing up out of it. Like I picture it being maybe like a crematory. And I heard it described as probably having an opening on the top and an opening on the side, maybe next to a mound of earth so that people could approach the top and put things into it. Actually, what I really pictured first was I pictured the Terminator. Do you remember that big vat of molten steel at the end? And I can't even remember. I couldn't even remember which figure was it? It was Terminator 2. Which figure was it that actually got melted in the was it Arnold or was it the other guy? It was the first guy. So anyway, this big molten giant vat of red hot steel, and this Terminator figure kind of just melting down into this is what happened, because the king said, heat it up 7 times hotter than normal. Now that's probably that's probably meant to be like a metaphor, just like really, really hot. And then it was so hot at that point that the soldiers, the best soldiers, that they picked the best soldiers, when they put Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire, they got killed. They died just doing that. Just doing that. And then it happens. There's a miracle that takes place. Verse 25. Like I said, verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Wasn't it 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" And they replied, "Certainly, O king." And then he said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." So, whether it was an angel or a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus, you can take your guess. Doesn't really matter so much. But there is definitely a divine being that is now miraculously in this fire. And reading on, down at verse 27, Nebuchadnezzar had them brought out. He was amazed, had them brought out, and all of these magistrates and everybody gathered around. And then down in verse 27, it says, last sentence there, they saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, not a hair of their heads was singed, their robes were not scorched, and they didn't even have the smell of fire on them. And then Nebuchadnezzar, he said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king and the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their God." Wow. What an unbelievable story. So, this is an act of, there are acts of civil disobedience which are covert. But this is a very public display of civil disobedience. And there are many instances of civil disobedience in the Bible when it is the choice between disavowing God. And so this is a profound example of that. But what is it that inspired these 3 men to risk their lives like this? They had an uncompromising faith in God. An uncompromising, unflinching, unwavering, unflappable, resolute, determined, predetermined faith in the absolute goodness of their God. And they understood that this was the God that had revealed the dream to Daniel that allowed them to even be in the position that they were. And they had made up their minds that they would only serve their God. They would not flinch in this immense risk period. And what happened is that their uncompromising faith in God released the power of God. And we'll see how profound that was here over the next couple minutes. Here's the big idea, though. An uncompromising faith in God releases the power of God in every direction. We're going to see that this display of uncompromising faith, and by the way, you should now, I'm no doubt you're comparing this to the shadow case of your own life, and we're going to see how this kind of uncompromising faith in our lives can release the power of God in our lives in every direction, just like it did for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. An uncompromising faith in God releases the power of God in every direction. So let's take a look talk a little bit about this uncompromising faith. So the first thing we see, their uncompromising faith resulted in them facing a very real personal danger and threat to their own safety. unflinchingly. They made the decision they would rather die, they would rather burn in the fire, if that would be what was required of them, than bow to another god, to worship some idol that had been created. They were unconcerned about what other people thought about them. You've heard me say on a number of occasions around here, it's one of my favorite sayings, is that since half the people in the world aren't going to like you anyway, they might as well not like you for the right reasons. And then they had an uncompromising faith to the point of this civil disobedience. An amazing display of uncompromising faith. And these are the kinds of things that an uncompromising faith ought to do. And then it released the power, though, of God. It released the power of God in every direction. Amazing, amazing. First, to the unbelievers. I suspect that this was a more powerful witness to unbelievers than all the books that had ever been written in the history of the world, except mine, of course. You take all the book learning, all the theorizing about God you want, but you give people a miracle of this magnitude based solely on the uncompromising faith of these, well, based on the humanly speaking, based solely, humanly speaking, on the uncompromising faith of these three men. And it went out in the direction of the unbelievers. But you know, it also went out in the direction of the believers too. How many believers had bowed before this idol? How many of those people rethought their position when they saw the unflinching courage and the uncompromising faith of these three men? So it went in the direction of the unbelievers. It went in the direction of the believers. It went in the direction of God. Their uncompromising faith brought God, perhaps the pre-incarnate Jesus, into a visible manifestation that was actually seen. So, I mean, wow. So, in the direction of unbelievers, believers in the direction of God, it released the power of God in the direction of Nebuchadnezzar. Look at again, verse 28. Nebuchadnezzar now, polytheist, but he says, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They trusted in him. They defied the king's command. They were willing to give up their lives. And now, in verse 29, we haven't read this yet. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're going to get cut into pieces. Their house is going to be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. Wow. So it went in the direction of the believers, went in the direction of the unbelievers, went in the direction of God, went in the direction of Nebuchadnezzar. It went in the direction of the Jews. The Jews now become a protected people. They were an unprotected people. They were like the people standing and clapping for Stalin. They were unprotected. But now the dictator has changed his mind, and the Jews become a protected people. Do you see how powerful uncompromising faith is? How it does release the power of God in every direction. Believers, unbelievers, God, the dictator, to the protection of the people, and then even to the ones who exhibited the uncompromising faith themselves. Look down at the next verse. Verse 30, then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. God saw to it that they were blessed for their uncompromising faith. This is a passage about uncompromising faith. This is a passage that says that an uncompromising faith, and that's the big idea, that an uncompromising faith in God releases the power of God in every direction. In every direction. So now let's bring it home. Let's move from royal robes of thousands of years ago to the blue jeans of today. All right? What happens today when you trust in God regardless of the risk? I used to play tennis with a man, Jerry Miller, and Jerry worked for an oil company and ran the Florida, for this oil company. And he told me that one time some men from the home office in, where the oil company's headquartered in Dallas or Houston? Houston, yeah. So they came from Houston and went out to dinner. And then they wanted to go to a topless bar. Well, Jerry is a Christian. He's driving. And he said, so he tried to talk them out of it, but they were committed to it. So he has a dilemma. Does he compromise his faith? So he drove them to the topless bar. And they went inside, they, meaning the men from the home office, went inside for a couple of hours while my friend Jerry sat in the car for 2 hours. Don't think for a second that something that seems so small does not, in fact, reach the attention of God in heaven and release the power of God in every direction. Imagine what some of those men whose mommies had dragged them to church in their earlier days, imagine what they were thinking when they were inside the topless bar and they knew that there was this man of uncompromising faith sitting out in the car. Imagine the testimony. And then, just to wrap that up quickly, long story short, God did bless Jerry Miller. He ended up being one of the top 100 executives. The chairman of the board at this particular oil company had a group of 100 executives that were in his flock. I can't think of the right word. They were in his group. And my friend, over the next 10 or 15 years, he actually ended up being one of the top executives, way, way, way above all those home office people that had come to make their visit. God honored him. God blessed him. An uncompromising faith releases the power of God, and not only in every direction, but in directions you hadn't even thought of yet. There are ways that God will use uncompromising faith that are incalculable, just virtually incalculable to us. And what happens when you don't? But what happens when you don't? What happens when you do go into the topless bar? Or you do bow down, you do make an idol? Basically, I'm going to say this. This is coming to me right now. So let me think about it for 10 seconds here. If I want to say this. Yeah, I think I want to say this. What we do is when we don't live with uncompromising faith, is that we neuter the power of God in the world. We neuter the power of God. There is a raw power of God that wants to be at work in the world. But God has chosen for sometimes to work supernaturally, but mostly to work through you and I. And when we don't have, and when we compromise, somebody gets hurt. When somebody knows you're a Christian and you nobody else is around except the two of you, and the talk starts to go raunchy and you go with it, you just compromised your faith. You've just neutered the power of God in that man's life or that person's life. Absolutely. There are people in the world today who are facing real choices with their faith. In the book Radical, David Platt tells a story about going to an Asian country. where over the course of the morning, one by one, at different times so as not to attract attention, 20 Christian leaders gathered together. They formed a circle. They started to share. One big brusque guy said, I need God's grace. I'm hurting here because some of his people have been kidnapped by a cult and tortured. And some of the people apparently even had their tongues cut out. And he was sharing this in the group of 20 who were meeting in a clandestine location. Another Christian leader, a woman, said that in her church, several of the people, the officials, had come and they had threatened them that if they did not stop reading the Bible and stop having Bible studies, that they would confiscate their properties and they would be arrested. And she asked for prayer. And at that point, everybody in the circle just began to pray. And for the next 1 hour, they poured their hearts out to God. God, we love you. God, we need you. God, please come. And at the end of an hour, they closed up their Bibles. They stood up. And David Platt, the author of the book Radical, he said there on the floor in a circle where they had been on their knees were little puddles of tears. Little puddles of tears. So is it so much to ask that we would have an uncompromising faith when we can, when there are so many people who have an uncompromising faith where they can't? Do you believe that an uncompromising faith releases the power of God? Do you? Do you believe that an uncompromising faith releases the power of God in every direction? If so, then do you want to have an uncompromising faith? It's a decision that you and I make. The big idea this morning is this: an uncompromising faith in God releases the power of God in every direction. Do you want that? Let's go get it. Let's go get it. Right after prayer. Our dearest Father, Lord, these are three very cool guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And Lord, we praise you for putting, for the recording of this miracle and the uncompromising faith of these three men. And Lord, I just pray that you would transform our hearts this morning, that you would give us such an unflinching, unwavering, uncompromising faith that we will never be the same. Lord, many in this room already have that. I pray that you would use this to reaffirm what they already have. For those of us who don't, Lord, give it to us now. Come, Holy Spirit, give us your power. We need you. We need this faith. Our nation needs this faith. We need to pledge our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor to you. And we do this in Jesus' name. Amen.